Have you ever heard of the very interesting story of Dr. Kellogg and his cereal selling brother? Well, it's a really interesting story of 15-gallon enemas, celibacy, bran cereal. And then you might ask, what in the world does that have to do with cooking and cookbooks? Well, this is the Pastime Cooking. If you follow my channel, you know I've been cooking my way through our family's old collection of recipes. And today, I pulled out a really strange one in my collection. It's called Keep on the Sunny Side of Life. It was produced by the Kellogg's Corporation. Now, it's not so much of a cookbook, although it does have recipes in it, as a kind of guide to living. When it comes to cooking and cookbooks and just old food history in general, there's not a whole lot of stories that are more interesting than the Kellogg story, in my opinion. Now, the story starts with Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, and he was an actual physician, apparently an amazing surgeon, and he was the main staff physician of the sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. Along with being an excellent surgeon, he also had these really bizarre ideas about health. In fact, he had this whole way of living called biological living. Now, they weren't all bad. He was a very strong believer in being a vegetarian. He believed in cutting the calories out of food. He was not a proponent of sugar of any kind. He had a very unusual fascination with the colon. In fact, he was said that the colon was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. He even called it his first and greatest love. He was the main doctor at this sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and his brother was the bookkeeper. And his brother helped him come up with some of the recipes that they actually originally developed for their bran cereal. Because Dr. Kellogg was a firm believer that you needed as much fiber and roughage in your diet as possible. The problem is, fiber doesn't always taste very good. So they were trying to come up with some ways to make it actually more palatable. So one night, his brother accidentally left out some, I think it was wheat berry dough on the counter. And the next morning, he decided, even though he thought it was ruined, he would try to give it a try through these rollers. And when he did, it made these dried, crispy flakes known as bran flakes. That was the beginning of the cereal, the Kellogg's bran cereal. Now, from there, they were able to incorporate this bran cereal into lots of different recipes that they fed to their patients at the sanitarium. Now, when you hear the word sanitarium, you're probably thinking like TB sanitarium, things like that. But a sanitarium of the day was kind of like a spa for patients. Really famous patients would come. And some of his more famous patients were Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, Henry Ford. One time, he was treating over 7,000 people in his sanitarium. He would do really unusual things. He did do 15-gallon per minute enemas. That was probably his claim to fame. He also did what he called continuous bathing. He would put a patient in a bathtub and leave them there for days with kind of continuously running water. They were only allowed to get out to go to the bathroom. He was also a really big proponent of being celibate. He thought that sexual activity was nasty and just full of microbes and germs. In fact, even though he was married, he supposedly was completely celibate for over 40 years. Now, while Harvey was a doctor, his brother was not, and he decided he wanted to commercialize the flaking bran cereal that they had made. They didn't see eye to eye on this, and that's because Dr. Harvey would let people in to watch them actually make the flaking process of the cereal. And in fact, during one of these times that he invited a guest in, one of those guests was Mr. C.W. Post, who went on to become Post Cereal because he watched their process and actually, from what I understand, duplicated it. Eventually, the two Kellogg brothers kind of had a feud and a falling out, and they went their separate ways. Now, what became the Kellogg Cereal Company went on to make all kinds of advertisements about their cereal. Put out a lot of circulars that contained recipes that included their brand cereal. Also put out circulars like this that basically gave you guides to dieting and reducing. If you have time, rewind the video and actually read some of the portions of the circular because they're really interesting. They talk a lot about the charm and the vitality of women. They talk a lot about reducing and ideal weights, and they even make a lot of claims that, you know, your greatest a way to be beautiful is through your stomach. Now, I do want to point out that Dr. Kellogg actually had some really good ideas. He believed that smoking caused lung cancer long before that was ever proven. On the other hand, he also was into eugenics and better breeding. Now, as far as their health went, Dr. Kellogg lived to be into his 90s, and so did his brother. So I guess some aspects of their diet probably did work. Now, as for this old recipe, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. I've made a few of the Kellogg's brand recipes in the past before. In fact, there was one that went around in the 80s, which had you make this dough and keep it in your refrigerator for up to 6 weeks at a time, and then pull out what you needed and bake your muffins. And to be honest, they were terrible. But this particular recipe was actually pretty good. I put a strudel on top of 2 of the muffins, and it didn't need it. I actually preferred the ones without the strudel. They were mildly sweet, not too sweet, but not totally bland. Actually had a good flavor. If I make them again, and I probably will, I'll use brown sugar instead of white sugar. But this recipe is actually something I will eat again. So I completely recommend leaving 15-gallon enemas, celibacy, eugenics, and better breeding in the past. But I say to bring this old recipe past to present.